Hi everyone, welcome to this episode. This episode is hosted by Victor Joe, the principal consultant of Your Self Partner. We are specialized accountant for construction business, and we create financial clarity for builders and trades through our tailored water CFO program. Today, we're doing an interview with Justin from JustSDA Management. Justin is a dynamic leader with expertise in the property development, project management, construction, finance, and social enterprise. During his career, he is dedicated to create home ownership opportunities for people in disabilities and has served a board of impactful organizations. So, hi, Justin. How are you today?
Hey, how you doing, Victor?
Very good. All right, so let's dive into this. Could you give us a quick overview of your business?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Victor, we're an SDA provider. So, we're just think of us as property manager on steroids. And Just SDA Management started 2 years ago. I've been in the sector for 5 years, and we're supporting about 120 residents across our properties now, which is wonderful. And we support properties as far south as Port Macquarie, New South Wales, as far north as Mackay in Queensland, and we've also got properties in South Australia in Adelaide, and then expanding into Victoria as well in early 2025. So we're almost there, which is great. So yeah, we're just a provider that's been around for 2 years, as I said, and yeah, just love supporting people with complex disabilities and helping our investors and development partners just be better educated in this space to do a good product.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. So, what brought you into this industry? What is your big vision? What are you trying to solve there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like it's when you look forward through your career, you don't really think about where you're going to end up, but you look backwards and it seems to make sense. So my background, I've got 15 years of banking and finance, running the numbers and lending and all those things. So chatting bank speak. I've
Mm-hmm.
probably got 15, 20 years of developing properties, and that's as a project manager, as subdivisions, renovations, you name it. And then I've also been in disability since I was about 11. So one of my good friends at the time was a wheelchair user and just didn't like how people spoke to him. So just took that around and would do some volunteering, some fundraising, and then that evolved over time into mentoring and entrepreneurship coaching, and now in board of director roles too. So I think for me, I've always liked to help the community and help those around me just improve their life in some capacity or some way. And I just think the NDIS is this amazing tool that we've got to really help improve the quality of the lives of people with complex disability. And SDA is just this beautiful sector where it's niche, very niche and small, but I can draw from my banking experience, my sector experience in disability, as well as my construction experience, and it seems to place me really well for that too. So I just love being able to help developers, investors, builders, all the way through to financiers, to people and families themselves, and then yeah, just help navigate the challenges of our sector.
Yeah, that's an interesting journey that you went through because I haven't heard a lot of people coming from both banking, construction, and background doing this NDS project. I still remember back in the old days, like when NDS first got introduced, it was a really hot but confusing topic. Is a policy start getting more and more clear for the investors?
Yeah, I think the scheme itself, Specialist Disability Accommodation, or SDA as we call it really launched in 2016, but and we're now what 9 years into the market, but it really took time for people to get their head around all the changes of legislation, all the rules and those sort of things to make sense. So the market really didn't gain momentum until 2019, 2020.
Hmm.
And then we had that little COVID thing. I don't know if you remember that. That kind of slowed things down. But now the market is really starting to mature at a rapid rate. There's a really strong pipeline. But while we do have a lot of structure and there's a lot of momentum now, there's also a lot of confusion still in the sector because you've got constant policy changes, different noises coming out of the media and the minister, and it's just hard to navigate some of those challenges. So I hope the chat today for your listeners will help debunk some of those myths and then answer some questions as far as how to approach entering the sector if it isn't a sector of interest. Because it's not as easy as it used to be, but
Yeah,
if you've got a rule book, then it can actually be quite advantageous.
yeah, that's brilliant. That's everyone was looking for, isn't it? A road book guidelines. So before we dive into the problem, I want to quickly touch on some of the benefits, just in case our listeners still haven't come across the benefits yet. So, would you mind speak of some benefit that you see investing in the NDIS property?
Yeah, there's probably a couple of things. I might even just talk about, would it benefit talk about the size of the sector, just so people get a bit of an idea around the scale? Would that help at all?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you look at the broader Australian population, we've really got 25 million Australians in our country. And of those, there's about 680,000 participants within the NDIS. So we're talking a small percentage of that 25 million. Now, where SDA fits is actually the top 24,000 of that 680,000. So we're talking a very niche market, and SDA really is for people that can't thrive in a mainstream property. Now, that might be because of behavioural challenges, mobility access, wheelchair use, for example. But might also be in that behaviour regulation, just not being able to control behaviours where you might lash out at properties, so more resilient buildings and surfaces. So that's, I guess, where the SDA concept was born, really. And I guess the advantages or what the benefits of the scheme are is it's a really good way, if we do it properly, it's a really good way to actually lower the cost of the scheme, because a crude example I normally use is if you've got a house with normal doors and someone just doesn't have the function in the doors or can't open the doors, you need a support worker to open the door and close the door. Now, it's a really crude example, but it gives you a basic point. But if I can automate that door and have a fixed cost to that automation door for once, that person can now have the power and the choice to actually navigate their whole house themselves, which means you don't need a support worker to do that 24/7, but you might need a support worker to maybe help in the morning with maybe getting out of bed in a shower routine or helping prepare a meal at the end of the day too. So that 24 hours of care drops back down to 6 hours of care. So, the cost benefit of that, when you're timesing that by 30,000 residents potentially, can be really beneficial. I think I've seen some amazing stories over the years, and for me, just the lives it can change and the families it can bring together. So we've had people live in houses where they can't even go up the stairs to say goodnight to their children. They either have to drag themselves up the stairs from their wheelchair to say goodnight, or they haven't been able to have a shower for 2 years. So they literally have a sponge bath in the lounge room every day for 2 years. Now, that doesn't seem right to me. That's pretty dehumanising. So the whole point of SDA is to solve those problems, to make houses more accessible, more inclusive, and just more empowering as well. And that's just good for everyone. It's good for the taxpayer, it's good for developers, it's good for the resident themselves and their quality of life, and just great for everyone, really.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. I guess that's really why that program got introduced. Let's talk about these misconceptions. Do you see people making any mistakes on the NDS investment?
Every single day. So I'd say the biggest mistakes is just this assumption that's very much like every other property sector. Now, there's elements of SDA they follow the general rules of property, but you can't just go in and build it where you think it's going to be built or what you think is right. The market is now at a point in the market where we're probably around 40 or 50% maturity of market. So you can't just go out and build it and hope someone's going to be there. You need to do a little bit deeper research and analysis to understand what's happening around that property, around the site you've got. What else is everyone doing? What's the vacancy like in that area? What's the demand for residents like as well? And just what's around you. And it's very basic competitor analysis that happens in any competitive market to really understand what's going on. And I think that's probably the biggest mistake. And then people being lured into these property spruikers promising 15% returns, often with a free set of steak knives or something really cheesy to get them over the line. And people sadly are falling into that trap and ending up building properties in the wrong location to the wrong standard with a very poor design. It's not just shoot from the hip. You have to do a bit more research. And as the market matures, that's going to be even more apparent. Because the average vacancy across all of SDA across the country, you're probably sitting around 50% at the moment. So if you get it right, it's great. If you get it wrong, you'll have a vacant property for a very long time and no revenue. So that's not good for anyone. That's probably the biggest misconception, I'd say. And then just not doing research really. And I've had investors come to me investing 1.5 million into the sector and they don't even know the name of the suburb they're in. Do your research, do your due diligence, at least find out what's going on there, what's in that suburb, what's on that street, what else is happening around it. Because I've actually got whole suburbs or even whole streets of SDA housing, and it really should only be a small percentage of the population. But I've got like 30 streets that I know of in West Melbourne, for example, that are just, they've got 15 or 20 per street. It's just not good at all. And a lot
Yeah.
of unhappy investors.
Yeah. So it's from that aspect, it's really similar to when you invest into a normal property market that you need to count the effect of the supply versus demand and determine where you should invest and what even in the same suburb, which street is better, which street got less potentials.
Yeah,
But
100%.
yeah, so in your practice, do you see in the same suburb that some property could performing really well, but the property come at a later stage just got a completely different performance?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, and as the market's really evolved, is the market's moving away from very high multi-tenant properties to either single residency or co-tenanted properties. And I think that will always be the case. Location is still a key factor in our sector. Like it is with most properties, location is key. So whereas you and I have the privilege of being able to jump into a car and drive to the train station or whatever it may be, or go to the shops, if you're living with complex disability, you're relying on your manual wheelchair or your electric wheelchairs. So the dependence on things being even closer to you is even hyper sensitive as well. Whereas you and I would be happy to drive 3Ks to the shop, kilometres to the shop. A person with complex disability would really only tolerate 500 metres to a kilometre. So it just changes the dynamic of what the needs are. And I think when the market first started, and it's still in some markets like South Australia, for example, and Western Australia too, developers are gravitating to the cheap sites of land, blocks of land on the fringes of the CBD. All those greenfield sites, big farmland that's being developed and slowly developed into housing. And what the challenge in that space is, so if you're a person living with very complex disabilities, the ability to rely on, you can't use taxis and Ubers because you don't have the money, you're living on a pension, so you need to rely on public transport. And a lot of those greenfield areas, you don't normally have public transport established by that point. They're still a new suburb, so it takes time to follow. And that sort of goes things like shops and amenity and public transport and even things like post offices, Centrelink, hospitals. All of those things in a new developed site normally comes 2 years or 3 years down the track once they're established. So there could be an advantage to play the long game there if you're willing to, but it can be quite risky. So the strategy, a lot of my developer partners, and we've got about 70 that we work with, we typically focus on infill sites and established suburbs because we know there's only going to be 1 or 2 SDA properties in those locations because they're already established suburbs with mainstream housing. And we know that the infrastructure is typically there as well. There's footpaths, there's street lighting, there's green spaces, there's hospitals, police stations, and then shops and amenity too. That's probably how we approach it typically.
Okay, so sounds like the location is the case. Location.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it follows like similar rules to the general mainstream market in that regard as well.
Yeah.
But it's just more hypersensitive because people aren't as mobile. So an example would be if you've got someone who relies on a wheelchair to support them with getting around as well, and it can be quite a psychological barrier. If you've got to transition yourself into a car, pack up all your bits and pieces into the car, and then when you go to the shopping centre, where's the disabled parking? It's right at the front of the shopping centre. So it can be quite dehumanising where everyone's walking in and out, watching you get in and out of the car. And all the things that go with that, it can actually create a bit of a psychological barrier so people don't go out as often. So if you can't roll somewhere or get somewhere easily, then yeah, like people just tend to get a little bit insular and then they basically live in their home and it becomes a bit of a prison. So if SDA is done well, we really should encourage that connection to community and accessing the shops and community spaces and local libraries and all those things. That's what SDA really is.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Very good point. Can you tell from your point of view, like how can property investors mitigate their risks in this kind of investment? What specific steps would you take if you are invested into the NDIS property?
Yeah, and this is something we do already, Victor. So we're a housing provider, we're the property manager at the end, we're the SDA provider, and when the market gets well established, we can focus on that. But at the moment, we spend a lot of time just educating and filling in the gaps in someone's team to understand and help hold their hand all the way through the journey. But essentially, the first thing is just really understanding your risk appetite. And that might be what's your budget, what's your plan, what's your location, and what's your strategy. I always start with the end in mind. I look for how to get out of an investment before I even get into it. So that way I've got an exit strategy and a backup plan and a backup plan. I come from Scottish heritage. I'm a MacDonald, so I don't like spending money. So I like to know how I can get out before I get in. Once you've got a bit of a strategy there too, and your strategy might be, all right, I really want to focus on housing in that 10 to 15 kilometre rim around a major centre. It might be, I want to focus on regional developments and regional towns only. I only want to do apartments along major transport corridors. Whatever your strategy is, it just helps have that laser focus rather than a scattergun approach, really. If you're looking at infill sites, is just really understand what's already there. And there is some publicly available data. You can actually engage professionals to help find some of the private data. Like we actually keep a big record on quite a lot of SDA properties and projects. So we use that to help our developer partners better understand the market. And just once you've got a good understanding of the market, then you can hopefully identify an opportunity and a bit of a gap in that market as well. If you're seeing a lot of one particular property type, you can focus on something else. Or if someone's doing a house for 3 residents, you might focus on a 2-resident house, for example, and then just bring something different to the market. So you need to build a really good team around you. That's probably the critical thing. So engaging a provider who has got experience in the space as well, like us or someone like us, really just to help hold your hand all the way through and connect you to the people you need to connect to. So the developers in your network, for example, probably don't need connections potentially to builders because they might already have those established. That's great, but they might not have an architect, they might not have an assessor in the SDA space, and they may not have an SDA provider. So we help them find all those pieces along the way and just hold their hand all the way through. But once you come to that design, you've got all the bits and pieces in place, then the key linchpin to any decision, to any development in this space is having a really good SDA provider. So just do your research on those, on whoever you are looking to engage as an SDA provider. How many properties do they look after? How big are they? How many is the team? What's their vacancy rate? Just ask all those sort of questions, and then work with them and understand the strategy and how they're going to approach it, so you feel comfortable with managing that. Have they worked in your area? Do they have a team member on the ground? All that sort of stuff. Just make sure you're ticking those boxes. But there's a lot of information out there. It's very hard to find that single source of information that's correct because there's a lot of conflicting information. Yep. So really rely on reliable and reputable sources. Like we provide a lot of information and guidance to our developer partners, and then I take them on a bit of a journey with us, so we're actually educating them along the way. So that's what we typically do. So that way, every time we catch up with each other, we're chatting at a much more mature and sophisticated level every time, and that means they don't need to come to me for that inquiry anymore. They can solve that problem themselves, and I'm not a single point of failure. So, yeah, I'd say to really start off with is probably just really understand the demand of that particular local area, and what sort of is there. And then once you've got a bit of an understanding there, and if you can't find it, find someone to help you do that. And then build a format or like a dwelling type that suits that, whether it's villas, apartments, or a house, or a duplex. And then, just manage it all the way through the process. Just find a builder ideally that's done it before. Building SDA is technically not that hard. If you've got a detailed plan, you should be fine. But the volume builders kind of struggle because they just don't have that millimetre perfect detail, which in SDA you need to make sure that certain tolerances and circulations are really critical.
Yeah.
And then, just make sure you've got that hand on the way. Get a good team, get a good assessor to help you, and a good SDA provider. That's still, the SDA provider is still the critical linchpin in this whole process.
Yeah, okay. That's great. I love your approach for number one, that you see that have the end in mind, like always know like why you get into this investment journey, and then like lay out every step very clear, understand the procedure, and the number three, having the right people surrounding you, like to protect your investment. I really love this approach. From the supply to demand perspective, is there any way that the investor can find out from the demand side how many people are really in need for the NDIS property in the particular area, or is there an open database for them?
There's a bit of information, but And the NDIS release data every quarter on this information as well. And if anyone wants to look that up, feel free to reach out. I'll connect you to the links to that.
Yeah.
But it's actually the state minister reports back to the federal minister.
Yeah.
Now, the only problem with that data, and a lot of people rely on this data as gospel, as the source of truth, but there's a few factors that you need to consider in this too. And I come from an academic background as well. I used to teach a lot of business economics and business as well and strategy. So I look to find out what the gaps are in the data. And when you make a data model like that, you have to make a lot of assumptions. One of the assumptions that's made is it assumes where people are living now is where they want to live. Now, that's pretty logical in a lot of ways. If it's an established area, their family's been there and they've got connections to that community, that's great. But what it doesn't quite do accurately is if you're developing in brand new areas where it's only ever been cows, paddocks and farmland, it's never going to show the true demand of actually that area too. So there's a lot of forecasting going on that's perhaps not as accurate as it should be.
I see.
So just be wary of anyone that is hanging a hat on the NDIS data. It is largely inaccurate. It's out of date typically at least 3 months. Like we're working on data from September last year. So that's 5 months, and that's reported 3 months in arrears. So we could actually be working on 10-month-old data. So you just got to be very careful. There are people that have access to other data, that private source data. Like we've got some private source data we've been collecting for 3 years just to really understand the market. So as far as you can get a general sense of demand, but it's not reliable, it's inaccurate, and the best thing to do is probably just chat to, depending on how much time you want to invest, either engage a good SDA provider to do that legwork for you, or if you've got a bit of time up your sleeve, then contacting care providers, get a really good feeling on the ground of what's going on, and look at some public resources to find out what the vacancy is like in that area. So in a really quick 5-second feasibility, napkin feasibility is, there's a web, like the realestate.com for the SDA sector is called housinghub.org.au. If you just jump on there and type in the suburb you're looking at and just do a search for SDA within 10 k's of you and 100 vacancies, you might not want to go there. But if you're seeing 20 vacancies or 5 vacancies, then there might be an opportunity. So there's still opportunities around, but if you add up all of the places around Australia, right now there's technically enough properties for everybody. Now, that assumes that everyone is being built, every house is being built in the right location to the right standard for the right people, which it's not. So really, although we've got all these places enough for everybody, they're all built in the wrong location. So there's major overrepresentations in West Melbourne, in all the outlying suburbs of Adelaide, Sydney to an extent, Queensland as well. So really, we've only hit 50% of the mark. There's a lot of properties, like right now I'm in Brisbane at the moment. So in Western Brisbane and Ipswich, it's about 40, 50 k's out of the CBD. There's now at least 83 houses with vacancies. Now, 83 houses means that there's probably at least 2 or 3 residents per house. Let's just say 2 for the purpose of this conversation. So that means there's at least 160 vacancies out there right now. Yeah. So building in Ipswich, I would probably strongly recommend against.
Yeah.
And the other area at the moment that we're seeing a lot of overexposure in is West Melbourne. So your Werribes, your Meltons, your Weirviews. And if you look at the data there, at one point in time, about 6 months ago, 10% of the entire SDA development pipeline in the entire country was just in that statistical SA4 region. So a lot of product, a lot too much of that product. So just use the data as a bit of a starting point and just sanity check that with other sources as well. And then reach out if you can. If you've got someone in your network that can get the data, or reach out to us, we can definitely help with that too, just to help make sense of it all.
That's actually a scary number. It represents how many investors could stuck into this scheme, not just not getting the return that they expected, but also hurting their cash flow and damage their capacity for other investment. Right. So
100%. And I've seen bankruptcy starting to go up, insolvency. So you've got to be really careful. And with this sort of property type, it is quite niche. So you've got to kind of balance that, appealing to as many people as you can, but still be specific to appeal to an audience. And just make yourself known in the marketplace as something different to everyone else. But if you've got a whole street with 40 other SDA properties on there, how do you possibly make your property stand out? You just can't. So it's, yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the remedy solutions for those investors who are already into the NDIS properties and find out it's not the best, it cannot be leased or is facing other challenge. What would be your suggestion for those investors?
Yeah, we kind of help some of those as well. We do a bit of pro bono work to help these investors that do have that overexposure and they do have a vacant property for 12 to 18 months. So you've got a few different strategies. You can open up the tenancy rather than multiple tenants with SDA funding. You can welcome a family. There's a special pathway called Appendix H, which allows a family to live together with one of the family members with SDA funding. That's one pathway. You can look at other NDIS support fundings as well. There's what they call ILO or SIL funding. You don't need to know too much about that, but there's other funding pathways and mechanisms that allow you to get some residents into your property. And then even some of our owners are actually retrofitting their SDA property back to mainstream standard and just renting it as a mainstream property. That's the only thing they can do because they just can't carry the vacancy for more than 18 months. And largely, if you are doing a retrofit strategy, which you don't want to do, it's a last resort, really. You're largely removing things like some of the automation, some of the handles and handrails and things like that are in the property. But beyond that, it's you've essentially got like an SDA footprint of a property is largely, it's got big bedrooms, big bathrooms and big living areas, which is never going to be a selling point, not a bad selling point for a property. That's always a good selling point. If you are building in the psychosocial housing environment, which is called robust housing, there's a lot more work that needs to be done to change the fittings and the fixtures. So that can be about $30,000 as a retrofit to have an exit strategy for that. And I've had to help quite a few residents with that too. But yeah, that's a factor that in at the front end when you're going into it, and how long you can tolerate a vacancy, and then what barriers you need to hit to get out. But if you're doing your research beforehand, you can save yourself a lot of pain. And for me, I don't know, for either paying someone to do a report for me for a few $1,000s or spending 10 hours of my time, like one day of my time, to offset $1.5 million or $2 million investment, to me, that's as a MacDonald and a Scottish risk-averse person, that seems like a pretty good investment of my time.
Yeah, 100%.
If you don't know how to find that information, then you reach out to someone that does. Like, we're very happy to help point you in the right direction to the information.
Yeah, that's great. So one thing people quite often ask is how long is this NDIS policy is going to last? Because in the past, we have different government incentives, the social housing, the army housing. They also end up with the government agency changing the policy and suddenly reduce the return on investment. So is this also a concern for the NDIS property?
I think it's possible, but I think there's probably more chance of bringing back gun laws than it is to change that. And the only reason I say that is so the legislation with the NDIS and SDA specifically is any change would have to pass both the lower house and the upper house of Parliament. So that's a lot. And given that people with disability in Australia represent 1 in 5 voters, it's probably not going to be an election-winning strategy if they did that. Plus, everyone that works in the sector as well. So that's just one component. The other component is Australia has actually signed up to the United Nations Human Rights Conventions for people with disability. So the NDIS is in line with that. And by them looking to remove it, it could actually potentially put us in breach of that Human Rights Convention. And I really see the NDIS as a lot of people are talking about it costing a lot of money. That's a lot of the noise. And if you listen to the previous minister about fraud, but the biggest waste in my mind in the scheme is not the fraud being committed, which is it's quite small in number as a percentage of the broader scheme, but it's still concerning. But it's more the waste is actually the inefficiency within the management of the agency itself. For example, for me, my team have to call up every single week and have done for 8 months for one particular client to chase a payment. Now, if there's a person in the NDIS that's taking that call once a week, that's an hour a week, that's 50 hours of work basically for the last 12 months or so, if it goes that long. And that's just one person out of the 120 that we support at the moment, out of the 24,000, out of the 680,000. So you can imagine how much wasted time there is just chasing your own tail. So if we can get that right and empower the staff on the front line to make informed decisions and get the outcomes quicker, then that's where the cost of the scheme goes down. So I think I'm hoping that the change of tone the change of ministry, or hopefully the federal government, there might be an election called pretty shortly on that, and that will hopefully change that tone. But there was a study done by a think tank a little while ago in Sydney. I can't think of the name of them, but I'm sure I can find the article for you to share with your audience.
Yeah.
But they looked at the scheme itself, and they said for every dollar invested in the NDIS, actually creates $2.25 of economic output and value. So it's actually generating and stimulating our economy.
Yeah.
There was an article that came out last week that talked about every house that's built in Australia, every SDA property actually generates around $5 million of economic benefit through job creation, through stimulus in shopping and all of those things too. So for a $1 million house, you're almost getting a 5-to-1 factor. And that's just considering the economic output, but that completely ignores the benefit to the individual that's living in that home and the quality of life they've got, maybe the reconnection back to community as well. If you get their housing right, they may not have to present back to hospitals, so that's saving thousands of dollars in clogging up valuable resources in a hospital. It's reducing the impact on the aged care facility. For people with behavioural challenges, of stopping police call-outs, which is thousands of dollars a week, a day, a month, a year. If you get it right, I think it's there to stay. It'll change, it will continue to change, but I can't see a world where the NDIS would not exist.
Yeah.
I just can't. It will change in shape and change in size and form, but I think it's just part of our, like we have every year. We've got a military budget, we allocate that. We've got Medicare, we've got the NDIS, we've got our pension system, we've got superannuation, all those fundamental things, and yeah, it's here to stay. I'm a bit biased, but I think it really is here to stay.
That sounds promising. So another question that specific for builders. I work with a lot of builders, and a lot of them are interested in this kind of project, not just as a builder to do the project for other people, but also coming as an investor, do and hold project for themselves, or do the project and sell eventually. So if any builder listeners want to start doing the NDIS projects, do they need to get through any specific registration to become an NDIS builder? And is there any particular requirement in that space they should pay attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's definitely a perception that you need to be certified as an NDIS builder, but there is no such thing. There's no special ticket or certificate or provider license. There's nothing like that. Although there's a few people out there saying we're an NDIS approved builder, honestly, there's no such thing. What does make a difference is someone who has built in the space. They just know the nuances of SDA. And really, if you've got a footprint and a floor plan and a detailed drawing, then anyone can be an NDIS builder. There's no issues with it. But what I would say is, the builders that tend to be suited to this are the ones that are a bit more bespoke, not so much the volume builders that have got the time to really just make sure that it's centimetre and millimetre perfect. To give an example, I had a big beautiful glass aluminium door. It was massive, about 5 metres by 5 metres a couple of years ago. And the builder went through and got it all done and everything like that. And then the certifier came out to look at it and went, ooh, that's 2 millimetres short. So they'd spent $15,000 on the frame, God knows how much on the glass, and it had to be ripped apart because they couldn't get it certified. So, so just that millimetre perfect and just getting it right the first time, because it's a lot easier to fix it on paper than fix it once it's built. So
absolutely,
that's probably just the attention to detail there. I'd say if a builder wants to get started in the space, what I do is I just have a look at some builders that are already doing it, just get your head around some of the designs and footprints and things. There's a great resource available online, which is a really good guide. It's actually the SDA design standard. I can send you a link to this afterwards, Victor, for you to share with the audience. But it's about an 85, 90-page document, and it goes through each room in the house and what the requirements are for SDA. How wide, how big, how long, how deep, what that needs, what it doesn't need. And it's not to be, I guess, how I recommend treating it is not as something you remember, but something you've got on site as a resource tool. So we normally laminate one of those and drop it on a site for any of our builders who haven't done it before, and they just use that as a reference tool and a reference guide. And then that with a good SDA assessor who comes out and, like a building assessor or building certifier, they sign off the building. The SDA assessor looks at it from an SDA perspective for approval. So they're always a valuable resource, and it can be a really nice guiding hand. So you make your mistakes and your mistakes are small rather than going too far through the project and making some big catastrophic mistakes. I've seen a couple where they've put the plumbing in the wrong spot and they haven't got the circulation requirement, so they've had to basically demolish walls and re-pour slabs. I've seen circulations in bathrooms missed by 3 mil, so they've had to grate back the tile or cut off the tile and grate back the foundations. I've seen some hideous things over the years, but it's better to just, what's the old saying? It's mark twice, cut once. Just, take your time, go slow, get it right the first time, and it'll just save you a lot of hassle as well. You have massive cost blowouts if you start cutting corners.
Yeah, great. All right, that's a great conversation. Thanks, Justin. And I can't see how much I learned from this interview myself. But I'm pretty sure that when people really start doing the investment or building this kind of project, they have millions more questions. If anyone listening to this episode want to have a further chat to learn more about NDIS or SDA projects, how should they contact you?
Best way to probably get in touch with me is via my email. So my email is justin@justsda.com.au, which is justin@justsda.com.au.
Yep.
And then I can share my details with you, Victor, to share with the community too. But happy to be a resource there. And I'll get back to you with any questions you've got, or we can schedule some time for anyone that is a supporter of your channel.
Lovely. All right. Thanks, Justin. Really appreciate your time attending this interview, and thanks for the value that you bring to our listeners.
That's my pleasure. If you want to do a follow-up check-in or have questions for the track, happy to jump onto another session.
Absolutely. I'm sure that we will chat again.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thanks, Justin.